Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So this is going to be the second video of this series on the Moscow Sicilian, where we're going to be looking at the third move bishop d7. So after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, and bishop e5 check, entering the Moscow variation, there's this move bishop d7, which historically has been the most common move. And I think that this move really requires razor-sharp precision in dealing with the most challenging setups, namely the Maroczy Bind. So either after white plays the move c4 in this position, or after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and then c4. So this is, I think that these Maroczy Bind positions are quite unusual because in the typical Maroczy Bind, which we see maybe, let's say in the accelerated dragon after e4, c5, knight f3, g6, d4 takes, bishop g7, c4, knight c6, bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, castles, bishop e2, and d6, let's say. We get this version of the Maroczy Bind with the pawns on c4 and e4 clamping down on the d5 square, and also a lot of pieces covering the b5 square. Because we know that in the Maroczy Bind, Black intends to go for one of two breaks, either a6 b5 to undermine this pawn, or e6 d5. And with this setup, White is arguing that they're covering both of the squares, and it's going to be quite a passive position due to the extra space that White has. But it's a bit different in this variation of the Moscow, because if we exchange the light squared bishops, then it's going to be we need to handle a position in a different way. Although I think that if you know the forcing variations in these Maroczy Bind structures, you'll be doing quite well. Although admittedly, I do prefer the move knight d7 just to avoid typical Maroczy Bind positions. I think that this is the most testing of all the variations, in my opinion. But yeah, bishop d7 is also playable, and we're going to be looking at a few sidelines here. First is this move queen e2. Not very challenging once we exchange the light squared bishops. We can play queen d7 here, just intending an exchange of the pieces. If they retreat, then White can simply continue with knight c6. Black can continue with knight c6 with no issues at all, with the queen on e2 not being very well placed. There's no reason, I think, that why White should go for this. Although I think that, possibly if they enter a Maroczy Bind position, this can still be fine. Yeah, but I think the main issue is that the queen is on a2 and is unable to support this d4 advance. So let's see, even after c4, they can't even push d4 since we will take, simply. So yeah, I think that that's not an ideal retreat. But and even after they trade the queens, clearly in this type of position, Black has no issues developing the bishop to g7, playing a6 b5 to find counterplay on the queen side. I don't think Black has any problems at all. Notably, king takes d7 is also fine with knight c6 next. So this position is okay. Not a lot of people will play queen e2 anyways. a4, interesting move. The idea is that if we take on b5 here, this pawn on b5 is going to clamp down on the c6 square and also open up the rook's file. And so we cannot play knight c6, and so this pawn is quite annoying to deal with if they're able to support it. And so we don't really want to take in this position. The thing is that a4, if we don't take, doesn't really make much sense, since we can continue with knight f6 and just ignore the bishop being on b5 here. Let's see, after knight c3, knight c6, castles, and g6. So this is the first moment where I want to draw your attention to. When do we go for g6 setups, and when do we go for e6 setups? So I think that based on my experience, the rule of thumb is that if White has played either knight c3 or pawn to d3, then this makes the plan of going c3 and d4 either one move too slow, like one move slower if they play d3, let's say, because then they'll have to move the pawn to d4 again. But with knight c3, they can't even continue with c3 d4 to try to establish a strong center. And if they're not able to do this plan with c3 d4 really quickly, then Black's g6 setups are typically very healthy. With the bishop coming to g7, playing on this long diagonal. And White has two moves here. They can play rook e1, which just looks like after bishop g7, looks like a very normal close Sicilian position, or like a dragon position. But with the bishop on b5 and pawn on a4 not really being particularly good. So I think that black can just continue with castling, you know, a6, possibly like rook c8, you know, yeah, just play out on the dark squares in the center. But let's say they can, white can also try to force matters with e5, but this is not really an issue after we take on e5, and then play rook c8 to defend the c5 pawn. And next we can simply castle or play a6 to trade off the bishops, play e6 and possibly knight d5, unleashing an attack on the rook. So yeah, this position is very good for black. Yeah, it's just equal. And instead of forcing it with rook e1 and e5, d4 is also possible, but after c takes d4, knight takes d4, and bishop g7, clearly with the same ideas as before, black has no issues because this just looks like a Sicilian dragon position, but with white choosing a short castle strategy, which we know that in the typical Sicilian dragon, if white ever castles short, then it's not really a challenging setup, and black is known to have like full equality. So yeah, these type of Sicilian dragon positions with white castling in general are very safe for black. So a4 is not really a popular or strong move. c4 is much more serious. So the idea is similar to a4 in that if we take on b5, our knight won't have access to the c6 square. And this makes more sense than a4 because at least this setups the Maroczy Bind with a clamp on the d5 square. And after we continue with knight f6, attacking the pawn, knight c3, g6 here. So again, if white is not able to play c3 and d4 really quickly, especially like if we enter this Maroczy Bind setup, in typical Maroczy Bind fashion, black setups the bishop on this long diagonal. If we play e6 here, then the bishop lands on e7, which isn't particularly active. A d6 pawn also becomes weak. So g6 is typically a more desirable setup. And white can castle here and simply transpose after bishop g7 and d4. You know, this position is fine. And transposes to d4 immediately. After c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop g7, castles and castles. White has two main moves here, either to play the move bishop takes d7 or play the move h3. This move h3 has a very particular idea in mind. The idea is to go for bishop e3 and set up and play b3 next, and possibly play rook c1 to defend everything. And so they don't want to play bishop e3 while running into knight g4, which could attack the bishop. And so if white is able to accomplish this setup with bishop e3, b3 without running issues with the c-pawn, then in general, white is doing very well. And so a6 here. a6 forces the bishop trade and also gets this useful move in, because typically we want to see counterplay with a possible b5 advance. After bishop takes d7, the dilemma here is always if we should take with the queen or take with the knight. And I just found that in this variation specifically, in this specific position, knight b takes d7 is the best move, because we want to gain quick counterplay with rook c8 to put pressure on the c-pawn and hopefully get him d5 next. If you take with the queen though, this delays the development of the knight, and and it gets, we can't bring our rook to c8 in one go. And so this is not really good after bishop e3, let's say knight c6, a4 clamping down on the b5 square. White just has a very stable advantage here. e6, d5 is possibly a plan that we have to go for, but it's quite difficult to accomplish this. And we don't really need to play queen takes d7 if knight b takes d7 is better anyways. And white can play bishop e3 immediately, which I think runs into some problems after rook c8 attacking the c-pawn. And this is a very thematic idea after b3 to defend the pawn. Black has this move b5, noting that they cannot take on b5 because the knight on c3 hangs. And so after we get this b5 move, we're going to be isolating the c4 pawn and have a very pleasant position. Even after queen e2, knight e5 is a nice move. Attacking the c4 pawn, and yet again after b3 we have b5, a very nice position for black. And so bishop e3 is not fast enough, and so they're gonna have to play b3 here. And after rook c8, again they cannot play bishop e3 because b5 hits, and so white is forced to play bishop b2, which I think that the setup with bishop e3 is best, and so this bishop b2 is a small concession, let's say. Black can play e6 here, seeing that there is no other. We cannot go for this b5 break, and so e6 here is a very typical break, a very typical move to try to prepare the d5 advance. And yeah, one game in the past has continued with queen e1. The idea is to get out of the d file to prepare rook d1, and also prevent any d5 advances, since this may run into e5. So yeah, after queen e1, yeah, also in this position, notably, you can look at all the arrows and see how the position can be played. So the queen, first off, can land to c7 to prepare the d5 break, because the queen on c7 is very important to, let's say, cover the e5 square. So as we saw before, if we play d5, then e5 cannot come because there are a lot of pieces covering the e5 square. Meanwhile, if we play queen a5, then we have more typical ideas of like maneuvering the pieces with like knight c5, putting pressure on e4, bringing the rook to d8, not really going for the d5 break, but just playing on the dark squares on the queen side. So yeah, after e6 and queen e1, we can look at two options here. They're both playable, but I think first off, queen a5 activates the queen. It's a very healthy move. Preparing rook d8 next, and after this, yeah, black has typical maneuvering play knight c5, maybe bring the other knight to d7 to e5, and maybe back to c6. You know, some possible ideas here. But typically, yeah, we would just want to activate our pieces. For example, this bishop. And instead of queen a5, queen c7 also makes a lot of sense. Now we're actually threatening d5 even though like white can take multiple times. If a pawn lands at d5, then it will be an isolated pawn which can be grabbed very easily with like knight b6. We see if a pawn lands on d5. And after rook d1, here best I think the rook f d8 is possible. Also preparing d5. But rook f e8 I also like, because the idea is also to prepare d5 next, but with lining up the rook to the queen. And so white should play the move queen d2 here, just stepping out from the e file. And now we play rook d8, now again threatening d5. First off knight c5, attacking the e4 pawn, and after rook f e1, rook e to d8, and now we are threatening the advance of d5. And additionally, we have ideas of playing b6 to solidify the structure and free the b7 square for the queen to put pressure on e4. And if white ever plays f3, like for example in this position, to try to support the e4 pawn, we see that there are a lot of dark square weaknesses as a result of playing h3 and f3. And so black can try to take advantage of the dark squares with knight h5, threatening possible bishop e5 and queen a5, bishop e5 to attack the dark squares, and queen a5 just to control some of the additional dark squares on the queen side. And let's say after queen e3, saying that if you play bishop e5 now, knight e to d2 and f4 coming is quite annoying, so we don't want to allow this. So queen a5, typical move. After g4, knight f6, rook f1, knight c to d7, freeing the c5 square for the queen. Yeah, black will try to make use of the dark squares here, although white does admittedly have the initiative with the pawns rolling up the board. So yeah, this position objectively is slightly better for white, although we can see that it's playable. This is one of the positions where I don't like. If I can avoid this position, I would love to. However, in this bishop d7 variation, I think that this is against a specific response with h3, this is like one of the best lines. So yeah, if you play bishop d7, you need to know what you're going into. So yeah, that covers this move h3. And instead of that, bishop takes d7 is the main move, and now queen takes d7. So now the idea is that white is not fast enough to play h3 and bishop e3, and so we're able to take on d7 with the queen and possibly play knight c6 next to threaten the possible exchange of pieces. Because in a position where we're down, we have less space, we want to typically exchange pieces so that our position is not so cramped. And if white plays h3 now, preparing bishop e3, then this is just a bit too slow because we have to move rook c8, and after b3, now b5. This is very nice, making use of tactics on the long diagonal. And after b5 here, knight d takes b5, we have knight takes e4. And so yeah, they can't take here because of the rook hanging. And so queen f3 was played once by yeah, Maroczy against Liam in 2011, and after queen f5, this forces the queens off. They can also sacrifice the exchange here with this move queen takes e4, and after this bishop takes a1, bishop g5 attacks e7, and attacks the bishop, and so we're gonna have to retreat with the bishop back to h8, bishop takes e7, and this position looks quite good for white at first glance because of this d6 pawn falling, the knights being active, and like weak dark squares, right? Yeah, but we have this move d5. It's a very nice move because it attacks the c pawn and the knight, and the d pawn is going to be lost anyways, as we see here, so it's preferable to move the c pawn to the d file so that after they take, we can blockade the pawn with knight d7, and we are going to see activity with like rook c2, putting pressure on the pawns, a5, possibly a4, and black's position just seems easier to play in my eyes. So yeah, very interesting. After queen f5, this queen takes e4 move. Instead, they can play queen takes f5, just trading the queens. After gf5, knight d5, attacking the pawn, knight c6, rook b1, and after a6, just kicking the knight back, and rook c to b8, because there's a threat of knight b6. Next, black will play the move e6, and white's coordination is just really lacking, and so this position is quite good for black, despite the double pawns on the f-file. And instead of queen takes f5, the last move we can look at is queen e3, important because this was played in the game by Maroczy against Liam. And in this position, knight c6 is a very nice move, an improvement over the game, saying that you still can't take on e4 because of the rook on a1 hanging. And so the best move here is rook b1, but after we take on c3, knight takes c3, we have this very nice move d5. A very surprising pawn sacrifice. And one thing to note in this bishop d7 variation of the Moscow is that there are many times where d5 seems like it can't be played, but we always need to look at if d5, or as we saw before, like a break like b5 can be played. Because in this line we saw that both the surprising b5 and now the surprising d5 both work. The idea is that they cannot take on d5 with the knight because the rook on b1 hangs, and so after cd5, knight b4 puts pressure on the knight on c3 and also the pawn on d5. So after the knight moves away to e4 and knight takes d5, black just has a very active position with the rooks coming, c-file, putting the a rook to the b file, and yeah, very beautiful bishop on this diagonal. So this is a very nice position for black. And so h3 setting up this bishop e3 is just a bit too slow. And so next we can look at b3, more positional minded, defending c4 so it doesn't run into any rook c8 moves. After knight c6, bishop b2. There's not just one good way to continue here, but we need to understand that this plan with a6 b5 is no longer possible, and so we need to aim for this e6 d5 plan instead. And so rook f d8 is very logical, preparing e6 and d5. After rook c1, rook a8 has been the most common move, but I don't really see a purpose of the rook being on the c file here, because we're not putting pressure on c4 anytime soon, and so this wastes a critical tempo. So in my opinion, e6 is best here, preparing d5 immediately. And historically what has been the main move is knight takes c6, though if we see like rook e1, this would allow black's idea of a d5 advance very comfortably. Let's say after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, we have this move d5, and this would equalize. After e5, we can take on c4, and if they trade on d7, then we can take with the knight. So queen takes c4, rook a8 comes with the tempo, queen e2, knight d5, trading on d5. First, we can trade a pair of rooks and simplify the position to such like this. And this is a very balanced game. Black's pieces are comfortably active. Black can try to give some loot to the king with h5, gain some space. Queen d2 to try to trade off the pieces and activate the rook. b5 to try to advance the pawns on the queen side. And this is a very balanced game. Instead of rook e1, knight takes c6 has been the most common move, saying that after queen takes c6 and f3, black is not getting the d5 break soon. But note that the exchange of knights means that there is less control over the b5 square, and so black can switch plans to go for this a6 b5 if allowed. Or they could also continue with typical maneuvering play with rook ac8, knight d7 to try to improve it to c5, and now and again a typical idea is to bring the queen to b6 and a5. to put pressure on the dark squares. And let's say, for example, king h1, rook ac8, queen e2, and queen b6. Black has equal chances in such a position. The exchange of knights really give black a fine position, even though they're kind of lacking space a bit. Though if they're able to accomplish b5, then it would be a very freeing break. So yeah, b3 is very positional minded. We can also look at f3 here, which is very innocent looking, but this is again one move too slow because of this move rook c8. And after b3, now d5. So very surprising, but this actually just works. The point is that if they take on d5 with the knight, we can play this move e6, saying that you have a lot of loose pieces on this diagonal. And if you play knight takes f6, after bishop f6, this just runs into some tactical issues. Let's say bishop b2, then rook d8 wins a piece because of this loose bishop on b2. So yeah, instead knight e3 has been played once, but now we have this move knight takes e4, unleashing an attack on the knight. And so after fe4, queen takes d4, the resulting trade, rook b1, knight c6, just gives black a very active position. The bishop is very active, the pawn on e4 is isolated, and black has the ideas of occupying the d file with the rook and also expanding with f5, so that if they take, then we can take back with the g pawn and have a pass pawn on the e file. So this is a very good position for black. Instead, if they take on d5 with the e pawn, they can't take on d5 with the c pawn because because this hangs, I think. And so after e takes d5, now we have this very nice move, knight takes d5, saying that if you take again with the c pawn, then your c3 knight hangs, and if you take with the knight, then after e6, a piece drops on the d file. So after bishop h6 here has been played a couple of times, many times actually in top grandmaster play, saying that you can't take on h6 because of knight f6 check, but we'll just take on d5, exchange the bishops, knight b5, dc4. After knight d6, rook d8, knight takes b7, making use of the tactics here because we can't take here. So we exchange all of the pieces, but in this position it's clearly equal and black has no issues at all. A lot of, dozens of games have continued this way with equality. So yeah, this position seems to be fine for, this move after bishop takes d7 seems to be fine for black. So we look at all of those options in this move c4. Next, let's look at the main move bishop takes d7. So this is most principled, and knight takes d7 I think is possible, but queen takes d7 has historically been the main move, saying that I want to develop with knight to c6, and in typical Maroczy Bind fashion, after c4, the knight just belongs on c6 here. And instead of knight c6, we can look at the alternative e5 in a bit, after we cover the main line. Knight c6, d4, it doesn't really matter if white plays d4 now or after castling, d4, cd4, knight d4, and g6. So typical fashion of playing against the Maroczy Bind. Knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, f3, castles and castles. So this is kind of an unusual Maroczy Bind because, as I mentioned before, white has exchanged the light squared bishops, where the light squared bishop on e2 controls the b5 square, and the bishop on d7 also, the light squared bishop that black has, also usually lands on d7 to support this b5 break. However, in such a cramped position, I think that the exchange of minor pieces favor black and give black a position closer to equality. What else? So in this position, there are many ideas to play for. The typical plan is either to go for a6, b5, bring the rook to c8, and try to make use of the tactics if white is not fast enough to consolidate the c4 pawn. And otherwise, e6, d5 is the other break to go for, as we saw in similar positions. And it's important to know that one tempo can either make or break the position. And so we really need to look at if the b5 break works, even if it looks like it doesn't at first glance. Or either the b5 break or the d5 break. We need to be very aware. After a6 here, white has many moves. We're going to be looking at them from the least popular. First off, queen e2 is just a bad move because even though it defends c4, because the main move here is queen d3 notably, but it may run into knight e5. And so I thought, what happens if queen e2? But this loses a pawn because we have this typical tactic of unleashing an attack on the knight with knight takes e4. And after fe4, knight takes d4, black just wins a pawn. So yeah, they need to keep defending this knight on d4. Another move is knight b3. It has some logic. It's quite uncommon, but the idea is that they want to exchange, they want to avoid the exchange of pieces, and in some cases wants to play c5 to undermine the d6 pawn. Yeah, and here I think that knight e5 is a perfectly reasonable move. After queen e2, rook a c8, c5, dc5, rook a d1, queen e6. This has been played once before by yeah, some quite strong players. Knight takes c5, queen c4. Yeah, trying to exchange the queens off. Knight d3, taking on d3, queen e6. And black has a simple plan here of trying to double the rooks on the c file, and this supposedly gives equality. Let's see, rook fd1, rook c7, bishop f2, rook fc8. And with play on the queen side here, black seems to be doing okay. Another interesting move is to look at is b5. I saw that the computer approves of this, but it becomes quite, yeah, play becomes quite strange here. After a4, knight d7. Yeah, I'm not sure that a human would play this like perfectly. Yeah, we're down a pawn for very difficult to justify compensation. Maybe we can say that black has pressure on the queen side, like in typical Benko fashion, but yeah, this is quite a nice construction. So yeah, knight e5 I think is most trustworthy. Instead of knight b3, rook c1 is possible, preparing to defend c4, but this is just a bit too slow because after knight takes d4 and bishop takes d4, black can, yeah, achieve the break with d5, with b5. And after this move, black can try to play knight d5, trying to change the pawn structure in a favorable way. So after knight takes d5, c takes d5, white tries to open up the rook and say that this pawn on e7 is a backward pawn. But we have ways of activating our pieces with this move bishop h6. First off, avoiding the exchange of dark squared bishops, which is very important. We don't want to weaken our dark squares. And after f4, we have rook fc8, and white's pawns can't really advance here, and so black will try to play on the c file. After queen d2, we trade a pair of rooks, and now this e5 move is very strong. Notably, queen d2 is not like forced, but it does defend the f4 pawn. So you will look in this line after e5. If they take on e6, then after queen e6, there's pressure on e4 and a2. Very good position for black. And otherwise, if they play bishop e3 back, now we will, again, we will avoid the exchange of dark square bishops, and we will possibly put pressure on the e4 pawn after putting the rook on e8 and possibly queen on e7. This position is equal objectively. So another move is knight e4 here, trying to put a piece on b6. And this was notably tried by Kasparov against Caruana, I think in their in the St. Louis in 2017 when Kasparov made his comeback just to play some blitz in it. Against all the super GMs. He played this move knight he was playing the black pieces here, and yeah, in that position, in that game, he continued with rook a b8, preparing some b5 advances. And if white plays a move like knight b6, trying to restrict, white's or rather black's advance of b5, and hopefully keep the knight on b6 forever. After queen d8 here, black will simply play knight d7 to exchange off the knight, and this is no issue at all. Knight c6, bc6 was played once before, but after knight a4 and knight d7, attacking the b2 pawn, black will simply play c5 next and control the dark squares. And after that, we can possibly make use of the d4 outpost. Instead of knight b6 immediately, knight takes c6 is possible. And after that, we will take back with the queen, putting some pressure on c4. And after knight b6, knight d7 again, typical way to exchange out the pieces. Takes, rook f2, and b5 here. Typically, black is able to accomplish this move, and we see that a lot of pieces have been traded off. Black is doing very well. c5 was played, and queen a7 here is a very nice move to pin the pawn to the bishop. After rook c1, rook b to c8 is a nice improvement, and we're threatening to take on c5 here, so if b4, black can gain counterplay with a5. a3 can be met with taking here and playing queen a3 with some pressure on the queen side and the bishop with good counterplay. And instead queen b3 here can be met with a takes b4, queen takes b4, and taking on c5 here. After we exchange everything and we play queen c7, black will possibly play rook c8 next to activate the rook, or play rook b8 next to defend the pawn on b5. And black is left with a very powerful bishop on the board. For tactical reasons, taking on e7 cannot be played because of rook c8, threatening to come in here. And after rook f1, queen a7 is a nice move, king h1, and bishop c3, attacking the queen, and the queen needs to keep in contact with this, with the bishop. And so queen d6 can be played, but after b4, this is a very nice passed pawn. a2 will drop next, and white will have to deal with this passed b pawn, which is not easy to stop. I don't know why I'm starting my words now, but yeah, this position is quite good for black. So yeah, this idea with knight a4 is not really very challenging, though we do need to be careful of knight b6 coming in. But I think after rook a b8, black is doing very well. And instead of that, let's look at a4 here, which prevents the b5 break permanently and is a very positional minded approach. And so again, seeing that b5 is never possible now, we should switch to the other plan of playing d5. And white can try to play knight d2 here, putting some pressure on the d pawn and preventing d5. But now queen c7. And black will try to improve the knight to c5 here. And notably, as we see that if white plays a4 and c4, the dark squares have been weakened on the queen side. So black will, black seeing this should try to make use of this fact. After, let's say, b3, rook a d8, preparing d5 next, queen d2, d5 here is very nice. Temporary pawn sacrifice, but after cd5, ed5, cd5, ed5, ed5, and knight e7. If we're able to take on d6 next, then on d5 next, then we will be very comfortable. After rook a c1, attacking the queen, queen a5 here, put some pressure. It still attacks the pawn, and d6 here is possible, but after knight f5, the pawn on d6 drops. So this is fine for black. Instead, rook fd1 is possible, but after we take on d5 and we take with the queen, don't take on d2 here because there will be knight f6 with check. So after queen takes d5 and we exchange the pieces off, bishop g5, f6, bishop d2, rook d7, preparing possibly to double up the rooks. Knight f4 is possible, and after we exchange off the pieces, this position is completely equal, clearly. So we're able to accomplish d5 in this kind of position. Rook c1 is also possible here, supporting the c-pawn prophylactically, but we have this very typical move, knight e5, a typical tempo move, which first off avoids the exchange of minor pieces and prepares to play d5 next move. If white plays the move queen e2, then we can play rook fc8. The question is always like, should we bring the a rook to c8 or bring the f rook to c8? And in this kind of position, I think that it's nice to bring the f rook to c8 because this has the same purpose, but this rook might be useful on the b file, perhaps. Since if we're not able to play rook fd8 and play d5, since white is able to counteract that with rook d1 anyways, why not bring the f rook to c8? After b3 and now d5, and I think black is a very fine position. Instead of that, if they play b3 now, then black can break with d5. cd5, ed5, knight d5, takes, and now a very important move, rook fe8. So if we take on d5 now, then white has this annoying move, knight f5. Not really trying to win the bishop because after we trade the queens, white's idea is to play knight e7 and force the king to an inferior square, recapture back, and we see how white's pieces just suddenly become active here. So very surprising way to just gain an advantage. But instead, if we play rook fe8, we're saying that this d5 pawn is not going anywhere, and we're now covering the e7 square. So after knight c2, rook a c8, black will now try to win the pawn immediately, but will try to gain counterplay on possibly the third rank. Let's say bishop f2, rook c3. Black has very active counterplay. knight e3, trading the rooks. This has been played once in the past, but in the game between Viktor Bologan and Radoslav Wojtaszek. And after knight d3, queen d2, just removing the strong bishop, rook takes f2. Now, notably in this position, I do like the imbalance of the bishop against the knight, because the bishop is such a useful piece in this open position. And b5 here is an improvement over the game, which continue queen d6. But I think b5 is nice to say that if you take on b5, then I will activate my queen, putting a lot of pressure on all of your pawns. And if you play a5, then after queen d6 now, black has ideas of infiltrating the dark skirts with queen c5, possibly bishop d4. And once black plays the move b4, this a5 pawn will be isolated and weak. So this position is very nice, and I think black can even play it for advantage, not just equality. So yeah. This a4 move is also possible, but I think black has enough resources against it. Now, the most annoying and the main move here is this move queen d3, which was recommended by Artur Nixons in his modern chess database, or his course on the Moscow Sicilian. And it's possible to play rook f8 here. This requires some investigation. This was played by Caruana against MVL. MVL played this against Caruana in 2021. And after b3, b5. Yeah, a very interesting break. C takes b5, knight e5, queen d2, and then d5. So this requires some investigation. Though, yeah, black has a very high drawing rate in this kind of position, so it is definitely playable. Instead, knight e5 is the main move, and after queen e2, rook ac8. So after this move, the c4 pawn is being attacked, so b3, and now b5. And typically, if we're able to accomplish this b5 advance, yeah, making use of the loose knight on c3, then we have a very good position. But unfortunately, white has this move knight d5, which forces us to take on d5 since there's a threat of knight b6. And so after knight d5, c d5, white has a very nice structure here, and saying that this e7 pawn is actually a backward pawn. So we're gonna have to play e6 here sooner or later to challenge the d5 pawn. And after d6, fe6, rook a d1, knight c6 back, preparing to trade some pieces, queen f2, rook fd8. We don't want to exchange the pieces on white's terms, so we defend our center here. And it's possible to take on c6 here, queen takes c6, play rook c1, queen d7, bishop d4. Very positional minded, trying to exchange the dark squared bishops to weaken the black king. But after d5, bishop g7, king g7, let's say queen d4 check, king f7, a move like h4 here. Yeah, I think that white has a very nice and stable advantage in such a position, quite similar to the main line after h4, threatening h5. So yeah, first off, I forgot to mention that queen f2 has the idea of just reinforcing this, this d4 knight. It's a very nice move to try to also prepare bishop d4 in the future. And after h4 and d5, correspondent games have continued this way and has shown that black has a fine position objectively, but I do need to mention that it's not entirely pleasant to play with the from a human perspective, honestly. After ed5, queen takes d5, knight e2. This was played once before in the correspondence game. Queen e5, knight g3, knight d4, knight e4, knight f5, taking on d8, and bishop c5. A draw was agreed here in a 2022 correspondence game, but yeah, it's quite an unpleasant position, honestly, due to the weak e6 pawn, white having active pieces. Yeah, and I mean, black has some advantages of, for example, the knight on f5 being quite nice, the bishop also on the board being quite active, and an active rook. However, this structural weakness really hinders me from fully recommending this variation. And so I do think that all in all, white has an edge in these Maroczy Bind positions against our third move, bishop d7. Another move here after bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and yeah, in this position we've examined c4 and d4, but we can look at castles here. And it's interesting because if we play the move knight f6 here, then this enters very typical lines after rook e1, knight c6, c3, and after e6 here, we're ready to meet d4 with d5. Very typical play, very common, everyone knows this. But an interesting move here is knight c6, actually, controlling the e5 square, so that after c3, black is in time to play the move d5. The thing is that if we play knight f6 now, then after d4, this is a very interesting and powerful pawn sacrifice. Something like this, with rook e1 coming, it becomes very messy. And so instead of that, d5 here is very nice, actually. Because if white takes on d5, then after queen takes d5, this looks like an Alpine Sicilian with the light squared bishops exchanged. And without the light squared bishops, I think that black equalizes quite easily, because typically our light squared bishop can be quite bad if we are forced to play the move e6. And for example, white can continue with d4, e6, bishop e3, preparing to take on c5, so cd4, cd4, and knight f6. After knight c3, black can play queen a5, and black has very easy play following bishop e7, castles, bringing the rook from f to d8, and playing against the isolated queen's pawn. And instead of taking on d5 here, it's possible to play e5, but notably after e6, we get, like after d4, we get this advanced French defense pawn structure, but with the light squared bishop exchange, which is typically our very bad bishop in the French defense. And so this just becomes a very nice French defense for black. And for example, after rook c8, knight bd2, yeah, I'm just gonna show one sample line here, which was mentioned actually by Anish Giri in his course on the Sicilian Dragon. It's very interesting to see how such positions can continue. Yeah, it's typical that we want to take on d4 here in the French, in the advanced French, only after white has played knight d2, so that they do not have access to the c3 square. So after cd4, cd4, now this pawn on d4 becomes quite weak, and we can try to put some pressure on it with knight e7, knight f5, knight g7, knight b3, knight f5. So yeah, the knight tries to infiltrate c5 here, but we're just in time to cover it with the bishop. Bishop d2 is interesting, and we play b6 here, covering the c5 square, and not only that, but also preparing to expand on the queen side here, possibly kicking this knight away from b3 to undermine the d4 pawn. And after rook c1 and bishop e7, a very thematic idea is to play this move g4 only after the bishop is landed on e7, because this removes the square for the knight. And so this forces knight h4, and after takes, and f4, white introduces some ideas of f5 or g5. G5 to try to trap the bishop, or f5 to try to go for an attack with f6. And it's important here that we have this thematic idea of playing a5, but in this position we might run into f5 immediately, and if we castle, then f6, and this becomes quite unpleasant to deal with. And so it's important here to play castles first, so that if f5 comes, black is just in time to play f6 and undermine the center, and black seems to be doing very well and has an edge in this position. g5 was one of the lines, and bishop takes g5, and it becomes quite messy, but black is on top. So castling is very important before that, and we're preparing bishop e7 and try to break the overextended center here with f6. And so white can continue with g5 here, trying to trap the bishop with queen g4, but black has this very nice resource of playing a5. And surprisingly, after queen g4 and a4, the knight has nowhere else to go but a1, and after that we will take on d4, sacrificing the bishop on h4 here. Rook c8, queen takes h4, and queen b5. And surprisingly, despite being down a full piece for just one pawn, the knight on a1 is horribly misplaced, and the queen on the b file here, putting pressure on the queen side, is very strong, and black will win back some material. And this was one of the critical lines mentioned by Anish Giri. And yeah, I just had to mention this line because this is very important to see that our bishop isn't trapped after the g5 sequence. And notably, if they don't play queen g4 now, then after, like, say, bishop c3 trying to defend the pawn, black is just in time to play knight e7 to f5. And with the knight on f5, bishop becomes surprisingly active on h4. Then bishop is now getting trapped, and black has these nice squares to work with. So yeah, this is a very nice position. So yeah, just coming back to the to bishop d7. So either the c4 immediately, or the more challenging bishop d7 and then c4. I think that this is the most challenging way to challenge black's position. An alternative that I want to mention is this interesting move e5. So this is a very double-edged move, and black tries to set up a clamp on the d4 square, and this is like relatively reasonable because white is not able to play c3 and d4 to try to break up this central structure. And the problem here is that it's a very double-edged move because we typically want to play our bishop to g7 and go for this f5 plan. But if white never takes on f5, then we're just going to be left with a bad bishop on g7. So it's a very double-edged move. And it can be very sharp and get out of control very quickly. After knight c3, knight c6, castles, and g6, a3 here was recommended by Arthur Nixons, again in his 2018 course, preparing b4 here to undermine the structure. Bishop g7, b4, knight g7, making sure that the f-pawn is able to advance forward, taking on c5, d3, opening up the bishop, castles, knight d5, and f5 here. And the move recommended was bishop g5, which intends to exchange the bishop for the knight, so that black is left with a bad bishop versus good knight scenario. And after this, knight takes d5 is best, removing the possibility of bishop takes e7 and occupying the central square with on d4. After knight takes d4 and c takes d4, white can try to set up some tactics on this diagonal. And here, the only move is actually h6. We need to kick the bishop back after bishop d2 and e4. Again, another only move. So yeah, you see that the position becomes very wild and very sharp. And we can see in a couple sample lines, for example, c5, e3 is the best move. Yeah, very difficult to find if you don't know this analysis. And after rook a b1, b6 here just prevents c5 and make sure that the b7 pawn is not hanging. And after rook fe1, rook a e8, we have a really messy position here, which requires further investigation. Objectively, it's playable, but I don't really want to look into a variation where only moves are the only way to like keep the equality, because admittedly, even though black has a nice center here, it is overextended. So yeah, that's a very interesting variation that I think is playable, though it requires very good understanding of such structures and such positions. So yeah, that covers this move bishop d7 on the third move. Hopefully, if you're not going to play this, then hopefully just like improves your understanding of such typical Maroczy Bind positions or such anti-Sicilian positions in general. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. If you have any comments or suggestions for future videos, please comment those down below. And in the next video, we will be looking at the third move, knight d7. Most flexible, but has the most theory. So yeah, I'll see you guys next time. See ya.